Is number 12 on the practice test? So you're given this equation that you need to maximize, and then you're given these subject to these equations. So first of all, you need to write the initial simplex tableau. So you do that by adding slack variables to both of these subject equations. So you'll write 7a plus 9b plus 11c plus some slack variable, we'll call it S1. That's actually equal to 7780, because that's the first problem. We've seen putting matrices into the calculator before, but we've only done it with equality, not inequalities. So that's why we have to change this to an inequality. So I'm sorry, we have to change this to an equality. And the idea was that the 7a plus 9b plus 11c is all less than 7,780. So if we add a certain value, then it'll make it equal to 7,780. So that's why we add that value. It's called the slack value. We do the same thing for the second equation, and we name it a different slack. It's our second slack value, so it's a different value than S1, S sub 1, so we call it S sub 2. Just making sure I wrote everything down correctly. Okay, then we need to turn all we need to set this maximization equation equal to 0. So I'm going to subtract the 12a, 17b, and 19c from both sides of the equation. And that becomes negative 12a minus 17b minus 19c plus p is equal to 0. Now we're ready to put this into the initial simplex tableau. I'll just write it right here. We have a lot of columns here, so I'm going to try to make save our space. Okay, just going to make sure that I have this all down correctly. All right, I'm just going to remind myself what each of these are. So all of the numbers in this first column all used to have an A attached to the back to the front of them. So that was the A column, there's the B column, C column. This was our slack 1 variable, slack 2 variable, and our P. And these are the answers on the other side here. On the last column is our answers. Okay, there is our initial simplex tableau. And now we can enter this into our calculator. I already have done this step, but we would note that there are 3 rows. So this is going to be a 3 by 7 matrix because there's 7 columns. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So I've entered this into my calculator. If you don't know how to do that, you quit out of this mode. You go to second x to negative 1, which gets you into the matrix menu. I go over to edit and go down to the matrix you wish to edit. I wanted to save it in matrix A. So I've done that. And the matrix you just saw a minute ago, we entered all the values. I enter a value, press enter, and then go to the next screen. I make sure that I use the negative sign below the 3 and not the subtraction sign when I'm inputting negative numbers into this matrix. Okay. Now that I have that in, now we're ready to identify the first the pivot column, then our pivot row, which will lead to our pivot entry. So I'm noticing that negative 19 is the most negative value along the last row here. If you look at the last row, the most negative value is negative 19. So this automatically becomes our pivot column. So I'll write it over here. This is our pivot column because the 19 was the most negative. Then now we have to decide whether it's row 1 or row 2 that is our pivot row. Our last row will never be our pivot row, so we don't really consider that one. So what we have to do is we have to take the value in the very last column here and divide by the values, the value in the first row, but in our pivot column. So it's 7780 divided by 11. And we also, for the second row, to find that ratio, we're going to do the number in the last column divided by the number in our pivot column, the 15. So these are called our test ratios. And I just calculate what those are, and I get 707.27. And then here I got 626.33. So that I take the smaller of those, that's the smallest. So that becomes my pivot row, the one with the smallest test ratio. So this 15 is my pivot entry. I like to make my pivot entry 1 because what we're going to be doing is we're going to be taking this entry where the 15 is located, and we're going to be taking a multiple of that and adding it to another row to zero out both the 11 and the negative 19. So zero out all the other values in this row that are in this column. So we're going to use a 15 to zero out both the 11 and negative 19, all the other values in this pivot column. So the first thing I like to do is I like to take so here's what is about like step 3 is describe your next 3 steps, because we've done all of step 2. I think we've identified the pivot entry. So what my next 3 steps would be is I would multiply row 2, because look at row 2 here. I would multiply that row by 1 over 15. And that's because I want to make that equal to 1. And 15 times 1 over 15 would be 1. Then, and see how it's the second row here. The next thing I would do is I would multiply row 2, because now you have to think about this being a 1 here. This is now a 1. So, I mean, if I multiplied everything by 1 over 15, that would then be a 1. So then I would multiply this 1 times by negative 11, and then when I added it to positive 11, then it would make this one 0. So that's what we want to do. You want to take row 2, multiply by negative 11, then add to row 1. Then after we're done with that, that would get a 0 here for that column. Then we would take our 1 again from row 2, and we would multiply it by positive 19 and add it to row 3. To say times row 2 by positive 19 and then add to row 3. And that would be describing your next 3 steps. So you can see this in your calculator. And let's perform these 3 steps I just wrote down in our calculator. Although let's just go ahead and do it. So I go second matrix, now I go to math. You can scroll either up or down to get to this times. I wanted to just times a row by something. So I'm going to choose that. Oh, hold on a second. Let me get out of here. Let me get out of this screen because I'm in the wrong screen for right now. Okay, first let's get to this. Let's get to this main screen by doing second mode to quit out, then do second matrix, then go over to math and times by a row. So I said I wanted to times by 1 divided by 15. All right, we can see what I wanted to do. And then I'm going to multiply that by matrix A. So go second matrix. And I'm going to, names is highlighted at the top. I just want to name it, I don't want to do anything else to it. So I just named it. And I want to multiply row 2 by that value. So I press row 2 and then press enter. And there we go. So now you notice that in that second column, there is a 1 instead of what used to be a 15. So that row used to be 11, 15, and negative 19. Now it's 11, 1, and negative 19. And it's also a lot of other. Here we go. There's it. There's the whole matrix, a little prettier with a little prettier notation. So, but here's our third matrix over. That was our pivot column. And notice how there's a 1 in the pivot entry now, which was third column, second row. So now I'm going to multiply this times negative 11 and then add it to row 1. So before I do that, I'm going to go ahead and stow this as matrix B, just so that we can easily get back to it if we need to. I'm going to name that. So it did it. Now go to second matrix, math. I'm going to times and then add. So this was a multiple matrix, row A and row B index. So I said earlier here, I wanted to multiply it by negative 11. I used negative 11. It was second, x to negative 1. And I'm going to take the matrix that we just got done working with, which was B. I wanted to multiply the negative 11 times by row 2, so times by row 2, and add to row 1. And there we go. Okay. So here's our matrix. Our third column over is still our pivot column. And notice how I had it 11 previously. So if I can go up, you can see that I had an 11 in that column before. And now I have a 0. In that third column over, we now have a 0, 1, and negative 19. So the next thing I want to do is I want to get the third row, that 19, to become 0. So I'm going to do what this says here. I'm going to multiply row 2 by positive 19 and then add to row 3. Before I do that, I'm going to stow this matrix. I'll call it C. Okay, then second matrix, go over to math. I'm going to multiply, then add. So what did I say? I said I'm going to multiply by positive 19. Second matrix. Now the one we just got done working with was C. I'm going to multiply that 19 times row 2 and add it to row 3, just like we said down here. And there we go. Notice how this third column is now 0, 1, 0, which is exactly the way we want it to look. So we've done the first 3 steps here of getting closer to solving this linear system of linear inequalities. We're not done because we still have a negative value in the last column here. So we would have to start over again and this would be our new pivot column. This was the negative 103 over 15. But this was at least the first 3 steps. So now I'm going to go along. So I didn't want you guys to have to continue to do this because it was really time consuming to finish this problem all the way out. So that's why we just stopped there. Now I'm going to go to step 4 in this problem and explain how when you actually got completely done with it and you no longer have any negatives along the bottom, then you would be ready to read it. So this is what it would look like when so here in this matrix, I look along the bottom and there's no more negatives along this bottom row. So I'm ready to read it. All rows that have nothing but zeros and only have one single non-zero value are the active columns. So this is an active column because it has just one single non-zero number. This is an active column because it has one single non-zero number. This is an active column because it has one non-zero number. Now, because this is just a slack variable, we're just not concerned with the slack variable. So we're really concerned with variables x, y, and of course p, because that's the one we're trying to maximize. And these other variables they're the inactive rows. So y here is an inactive row and S2 is an inactive row. We completely ignore. Well, you could either say I ignore those columns or I just set those variables to 0. Either way, those columns are not affecting us. And with S1, because it's a slack variable, we're not really that concerned with that variable, with reading the solution of that variable. We don't really care what S1 is equal to. That's not what they're asking us. So we're not really, we can kind of ignore S1 as well. So the only variable we're really interested in here is the X that is also an active variable is our X variable. So see how this is saying X, I ignore, like I said, all the other columns here. Because we don't have to ignore the column of P, it is an active variable. We don't have to ignore the column of S1, it is an active variable. But it does say 0. So that would translate as 1x plus 0s1 plus 0p is equal to 28 over 3. Well, 0 times s1 is just going to be 0, and 0 times p is just going to be 0. So it really just says x1 is equal to 28 over 3. Or 1 times x, which is just x. So we know the solution is x equals 28 over 3. For all inactive variables, I just plug in 0 for them. So y will equal 0. And now we can say 0. We can translate this last column now, ignoring all the inactive variables here. It just says 0x plus 0s1 plus p is equal to 308 over 3. So of course, these are going to drop out. So you're just going to get p is equal to 308 over 3. And that's how to read this column. This whole matrix solution. All right, I hope you found this valuable. Have a great day.